Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming. Have you all had a chance to look at the show? Yes. Good. I don't know whether you agree with me, but I feel that there's only a couple of things that unite the work on show here. And one is that all the artists are very serious about their practice. They've got advanced practices. And that, with the possible exception of Rose Wiley, most of them haven't quite had the recognition that I think they deserve. And the other thing is about the choice of work here. I wouldn't call this sort of shy, retiring work. It's sort of quite up and in your face. And I think that might be to do with the particular choices from the curator. So we can ask him about it later. But why would you have a show of all women painters in 2018? I mean, really, why? I know when I was showing in exhibitions of all women in the 1990s, I got asked that question, and it seems strange that we're asking it again now. I suppose one of the reasons is, if you think about that big show that some of you probably went to, The Painting of Modern Life, at the Hayward in 2007, there was only a quarter of the artists were women. When you think of the indiscipline of painting, that's in 2014, the Tates and Ives, a quarter of those were women. And in 2014 there was also The Show Is Over, the Gagosian, that some of you might have seen, and that had 34 male artists and 1 woman. And for the most part it wasn't really mentioned in the reviews. So it was just a show of painting. Flip side of that, if you look at the artists that Terps Gallery show, it's around 50% female. If you look at the Marmite Prize or Contemporary British Painting, so these are kind of more grassroots organisations, you've got over half are by women. So there are definitely women painting. We know they are, because we know that there are more women, considerably more women in art school and leaving art school than men. So something is still happening that means that their practices aren't being seen. And obviously, you know, the women can't paint, although is a reference to Bazlitt's quote, which he said in 2013 and then again in 2015, in case we hadn't heard it the first time, and was reported very widely.
Do you want to read it? Because there's quite a few versions and they're all good.
Well, actually, if you look on YouTube, there's Alexis Teplin and the curator that used to be at Serpentine, the education curator, Sally Talent, and they read the exchange between Bazlitt's and De Spiegel, and it's absolutely hilarious. So I advise you to read it. I haven't got it here to read now, but maybe we can go back to that later. I mean, he's not alone, of course, because David Sylvester, very renowned art critic, told Jenny Saville, and this was by way of a compliment because he really liked her work, I always thought women couldn't be painters. And when she asked him why, he said, I don't know why. That's just the way it's always been, and that's how it is. Which is quite peculiar when you think that it actually is, you know, quite a decent probing critic, but there was no questioning going on there. So I suppose one of the things is about, you know, the history of painting, and we're not going to kind of relive it here, we don't have time for it, but there is something about painting, I suppose, as opposed to other disciplines, where the history of it is writ large over it. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you was Judy Chicago, whose work has been in favour, out of favour, maybe it's coming back, I don't know. Quite interesting to think about, actually, in relation to the work by, what's her name? Was it Roberta Booth over here? Yeah. So in 1975, she's writing in Through the Flower, and she says, she's trying to explain her alienation from the practice of painting. So this is at a moment where, you know, the kind of feminist consciousness is coming into being in relation to art practice. She said, I have painted these large, technically formidable paintings, and, although they were beautiful, they still did not speak the language of my real self. I felt that I would have to give up the painting methods that I knew. I wanted to bring my art and my feminism together, and I did not see how to do it with the art-making methods I had. So then she's talking about, because at the same time she was making these installations, menstruation, bathroom, etc. And in the end, she comes back to painting and she says, I wanted to wed my skills to my real ideas. I realised I did not have to abandon my art-making process. So although that seems rather crude now, I think, perhaps to us, you can see a kind of real dilemma going on about how to use this language painting that she clearly loved, because it's sort of tainted history, as it were. So I guess, I just wanted to have those remarks to just frame the conversation that we're going to have. And one of the first questions that I wanted to ask our panellists, because we're here and we know that they have got extensive practices, quite often doing lots of different things, I wanted to ask panellists if they could describe or contextualise the work that we're seeing here. Because it might be that the work is very, represents their practice very well, or perhaps this is something that's slightly different, whether it's new work or older work. So maybe Geraldine, we could start with you. If you could just tell us a little bit about your work that's in the show, and then maybe give us a context for it.
Okay. So it's two very small paintings upstairs. They're made in enamel on metal, and they're part of a load of paintings that I've made in the last 3 or 4 years. And it happened very suddenly. I was making big oil paintings on canvas, and I was in a band, and then literally overnight I started painting very small, and I've been pretty much doing so ever since.
Thank you. Yeah,
kind of
I think that's useful. Cherry.
Well,
we've got the
there's
three,
two upstairs.
yeah, one over there
Yeah.
and two upstairs.
Yeah, well, they are kind of representative of what I do, although it's not the only thing I do. And I do quite often paint myself as specific male people, like Dylan Thomas or well, I don't call it Burroughs. Burroughs upstairs, but there's also some other ones that I've done, like Jackson Pollock and John, which aren't in the show. But so it is fairly representative of what I do, although I do other things as well.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that series of self-representations?
Well, the very first one I did was actually of Richard III, after seeing an all-woman production where Catherine Hunter from Complicité was Richard III. And talking to her afterwards, she said because she is a bit disabled, and she said she brought out the sort of disabled and masculine side of her. And I thought that sounded an interesting thing to do. And I also thought it's more interesting having someone that's got some dubious aspects to the character. I mean, not that there was, Dylan Thomas was, he was a drinker and womanizer, but not that I object to that, but it's just interesting. It's more interesting, makes it more interesting for me to impersonate him.
And do you read their work to get into character? How do you
a bit, but also reading about them as well, and I'm also interested in how some writers and artists get away with things, with doing quite bad things, and everyone thinks they're still good because they're cool, and how some people are really against them, and that kind of interests me as well. And it's not that I really don't. I'm not disapproving of these people or approving. I think there's something that's fun about that aspect of them. Yeah. Whereas someone who was completely good, or that has a story of being completely good, wouldn't interest me so much.
Yeah, I think they're somewhat representative. I think in terms of surface that tension between quite painted areas and drawn areas, and also how I go about making a work which will be multiple realms of references. Like this one, I was thinking about Saint Jerome and the idea of a hermit and
not immediately, apparently. If you don't want
no, I mean the thing is, I paint. I have this version of the world that I'm painting in, and how something comes about doesn't necessarily matter to the meaning. It's just my process of going through. The background was, I can't remember the paint. It was from a painting of Saint Jerome, and then the figure came in. But I've been thinking a lot about this idea of ancestral bodies, because I don't make particularly English paintings, but I think as most of my family are Welsh, and there's this very kind of florid relationship between the body and the landscape, and that's really what hangs most of my work together. This is from a show I had at Exeter Phoenix last July. Was it July or in the summer? Which is called Landscape as a Peopled World. And I've been trying to find this vocabulary for making landscape painting. I was brought up on Dartmoor, and the overriding presence of painting was always the St Ives painters and British modern, which drove me crazy, because a lot of my references and interests were far more connected with America as well, and also with the human on the landscape. I've been reading there's a book by Pasolini called Street Kids, and there's a lot there to do with liminal spaces, like on the edge of cities, on the edge of agriculture. And when it lived in Dartmoor in the late 70s and early 80s, it was very much still the 19th century. You had that moment of change. So the bodies that came out of that, they came out, and I realised they were actually very 20th century bodies that I was painting, which is what that one's called, 20th century. And I think there's, they're not necessarily 21st century bodies.
What do you mean by that? What's that distinction?
I think there's a change with the internet and the millennium. I think there's something. It might just be to do with that consciousness of being brought up with a childhood and an adolescence free of the internet, and how it's a very different horizon. You had an external horizon, and your internal imaginative horizon was perhaps related to books or films, but not this kind of world you could disappear into. And that's, the internet I think has changed our sense of limit and horizon, which is, it's fascinating. But I think that marks a distinction with the body as well. So
that's really interesting. We'll pick up on that later. Josephine, do you want to tell us a little bit about your work's upstairs, isn't it?
Yeah, the two large paintings. One of them is called Shoppers, and the other one is Turp's War, sorry. Turp's War. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's your next painting, Turp's
on the brain. But so the Shoppers was from a series of work from 2015, and it was based around shopping and eating and sort of the mundane everydayness of boring things of life, and so I was fascinated with like shoppers, how they behaved, how the phenomena of shopping, and my own relationship to that as well. And also I've been watching a lot of horror movies, cannibal films and zombie films, and I sort of wanted to marry them. So I tried that in these paintings, and there seemed to be a link for me in terms of cannibalism and shopping, consuming.
Or housework being a zombie, maybe. So.
Yeah, and the zombie-like, trance-like way people behave in shopping centres, sort of, if it's Dawn of the Dead, that scene is like quite visionary to me, But so I was always interested in those things, and Turf War was also stuff I'd been trying to paint a cooker for years and not been successful, and trying to get this sort of the cumbersomeness of a cooker, of these white goods over in the painting, but I decided to flip it on its head and do it like just an outline, you know, so it's like this transparent thing, so the opposite of what the actual object is, you know. And yeah, I've always been interested in domestic, the sort of power relations in the family dynamics, what goes on in the home, and also in that, but not consciously, is sort of gender politics, I think.
It reminds me, the way you'd made the cooker become a body reminds me a little bit of, although it's entirely different, of Helen Chadwick's early work, where she's dressing up as the cooker of the domestic appliances.
Yeah, I really love her work, so that's, it's good to hear. And the penises are like sort of this intrusion, the sort of attacking the cookers, kind of. I wanted to create, they came after, I wanted to create a bit of drama, a bit of chaos, a bit of sort of a very high-pitched, emotional sort of snapshot of the situation.
Thank you. So coming out of that, I think for all of these practices is another question for me, and it's about images of women, representations of self. And I'm quite glad that the sort of moratorium on representing self has seemed to be lifted, because definitely when I was at college there was a kind of sense in which it was a little bit taboo for, in relation to kind of sexual politics, to image women, you know, because of the history of painting. So I wondered if you could all talk about that, whether you felt there was a special responsibility as a woman in making representations of yourself or of other women. Does that feel a burden, or does that feel that is a responsibility you want to take on? Yeah, I mean, I think that's particularly relevant in your work, right?
Yes, yeah, I guess. Do I feel a responsibility?
Yeah, do you feel a responsibility in the images you make of women?
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint, you know, what is so. Say these paintings I have upstairs. One is Butt-tastic, and it's a woman from a sort of 80s porn mag. It's a very specialist porn mag about spanking, and the other one is a picture of, you know, to all intents and purposes, a form of abuse, but the girl's smiling. So these are all really tricky things that are getting talked about a lot. You know, like, so what were you doing up in that room? You know, how come you didn't walk out? You know, why were you compliant? You know, these kind of things. And I suppose I got into those subjects by I'm very interested in photographs and stuff people get up to when they won't get caught, and the murk of it all. I mean, there is a huge political and you know, kind of thinking about this when we were at art school, and but then out in the real world, and I worked in Soho for years. You know, it's a completely different marketplace and different currency, and you know, working in those kind of territories, working on those kind of images in movies and also in printed literature, and you know, like the kind of big thing in Soho at the time was clip joints, and I knew a lot of people who worked in those places, and it was kind of common currency, and it wasn't like a, you know, and then you start to get into the nuance of this politics of what's going on out there, you know, and what people can do now on the internet is completely different. But something about the images I was using or kind of ending up painting, a lot of them were like epitaphs. You know, there's two things about photographs: when you turn a camera on something, it's either going to be a captain of industry or a prostitute. The very early photographs, and I collect very, very early photographs. Similarly, you know, hand a mirror to a chimp, it'll look at itself and then its arse. So, you know, it's like this kind of, you know, it's like this, but then also painting these women, that were in these photographs, and they were really young and, you know, quite close to death, obviously, and also I was working at Vintage Mads, you know, which was this they used to get like truckloads of old ephemera, and you go through it and you get to see stuff, you know, and there's this stuff about what really happens, what people really look at, what people really got collections of, and what it really means to try and be okay and not be cruel, and friends who worked in the porn industry and what their moral choices, their moral compasses, you know, and really amazing and strange arbitrations of, you know, behaviour, but there's also a kind of humour to it, you know, not about the don't look away, not about the man and the girl. That's a very different painting. But the Butt-tastic comes out of that absurdity, that thing of sex work, you know, like of a type, and what people do in it, and how they, you know, cope with it, and how they project themselves, and then how we then look at it, and so they're kind of epitaphs, a lot of that series, you know.
So do you see them as critical works? I don't mean criticising, I mean critical in that they open up a particular kind of debate.
Absolutely. I mean, that stuff with the girl, you know, that was obviously an identification, because, you know, I looked like that at the set. You know, we all had this Diana hair in about 1980 kind of thing, you know? and this was happening to friends, and yeah, just, you know, I had to do that painting, you know.
And just one more question about the works upstairs. The difference in scale between the little work on aluminium
And the big one.
and the big one. Could you talk about that?
I suppose the big one's there because it and it was in the solo show at Fine Art, because it was the painting that kind of bridges that they're working on the metal, and I just really loved medieval art, and there's a painting of Richard II in Westminster Abbey. It's really beautiful, kind of altarpiece kind of thing, and it was like that. So I was priming things in this. It became more and more metallic, and eventually it just became metallic, and it was this. Then the jump to metal. So it's kind of that. It's just that jump, and because it was about, you know, stuff about paintings of women, paintings of me, paintings of my identification with them. So that's why it's there. And it, you know, I was painting that big and bigger, you know, until it would have been like December 2011. Just went small tabletop.
So what about this question about representation of women?
I mean, sorry, yeah.
I was just thinking Cherry or anybody really.
Oh, well, I think it's really good that the history of art is so much to do with men's images of women, in the sense that it's got tremendous scope for how women can then subvert that medium, and that's what I want to do, to subvert it. But I also very much don't want to make myself a victim, which is why I'm the sort of difficult person, do myself as the difficult person rather than the victim, because I don't want to think of myself in that way, and so that's.
So it is aware that the complexity of looking at the woman who is assuming the male, but not really, you know, still herself.
Yeah, well, I also want it to be funny. You know, I think it is funny, but you know, that doesn't mean it's not serious as well. And I don't know what they mean in the sense of, you know, they're just sort of, it's just trying to subvert the image of a woman, really, that you normally get in the history of art.
Well, I've got to ask it of you, actually. What? Because I can imagine old school, sort of slightly one-dimensional feminist critique of that work.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought of liberty. You know, I mean, the painting for me is liberty, and it seems natural that the body that I represent, there's that sense of liberty as well. I think, yeah, hard question, I suppose. Actually, when I met Jessie Mackinson for the first time, she said to me, "Why do you draw women with such big breasts?" And I said, "Well, look at me, it's my normality." And it's kind of weird to say that to an audience because that's a very private thing I've never said to anybody. So I'm now sharing with you. But it's my normal life. It's been my life for 30 years. And so not to paint that would be a misnomer. And not to paint that sense of liberty. And also, I think in my work, I'm always seeking, because I've never felt any shame about the body. And I might have felt more shame about my facility to draw, and not necessarily paint, because I didn't start painting till later, but my facility to draw with a representational style, which is just very natural to me. And so when I began to make those decisions in around 2011 about what I wanted to do, it was to paint the specific, and also to paint with this liberty, and to paint the body that I wanted to paint. And I think you said a word, absurd, which I think is a great word, because there's this kind of foolishness about the body, and this potential for the female body to take the absurd and take the sense of the fool. So with a kind of gentle humour. There are certain characters I will put through some suffering, but I wouldn't do it to all of them. And I'm also representing men as well. And there isn't really, there are a couple of them who, a Bonehead, who is in one of the drawings through there, who has the big bone in her head. She's probably the closest one to a kind of story of myself. So I can do far worse things to her, and there's nothing particularly violent, but I can just push the limits with her. I have a different sense of responsibility to her because that's closer to me. If it's somebody else, it's sometimes it's harder. So there is a certain amount of responsibility in that. But it's certainly, I get asked about, porn and the male gaze, and I sort of think, well, bodies exist outside of porn. It seems very limiting to assume that this is a pornographic body because it has large breasts and it has blonde hair. That's me.
But it's a very particular kind of comic book image.
Yeah.
That there is a tradition of, right? I mean,
I suppose
of representation.
But there are certain things like, she's got muddy legs, she's got, there are a lot of specifics that don't fit with that. The way her rib comes down to her belly, you wouldn't get that drawn in the types of images that we're talking about. And I think, I've looked so much at images, and there is this cartoon line that I use, but there's also a naturalness, and it's this coexistence that I think, is the line that I'm treading on.
Yeah.
Which will leave ambiguity and will leave it open to misinterpretation as well.
And that's fine.
What can you do? I don't want to work with fixed meanings. That would be dogmatic. Yeah.
Yeah, you do. I do feel. I suppose I question why am I. Well, I did question why would I paint the female body. It's like old hat kind of. Why. I'm not tied to my body, or just because I'm a female artist, I don't have to paint female nude or something. And the sort of loadedness of the female nude in painting history, I wanted to sort of sidestep that and not. I painted men for quite a long time, but I kind of always come back to it, and I think it's, I suppose, what or it's not. I don't consciously try to subvert it. In fact, I just go into the stereotype more. So the woman is who's domestic, who's doing the shopping or doing the cooking, or I sort of go into that more and find humour in it somehow. I'm still exploring it, so I don't know quite where I stand with that. But there is a sense of responsibility. because of the loadedness of
Yeah.
the female body in art. You know.
But I suppose what I like is the responsibility in this work is it's there, but it's not laboured. It's you know it's something that that's not tying people down,
Well,
which I
we're not-
kind of feel like it in a different generation it might have done.
Because, you know, we're not social science students, we're artists, and we need to be able to push the envelope.
Have the audience got any questions? It'd be quite good to have a conversation.
I have a question. It's not about women, actually. Is that okay?
Thanks.
No, I have a question. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. I don't tell me the glasses. What's your name, sorry?
Hannah.
Hannah, my apologies. Before you said that you painted in the style not of the English, I just wondered what you meant by that.
I think English painting is often quite humble. I always felt, and there's also things to do with a tonal palette. I lived in Berlin for a long time, and that's when I started to paint. And I noticed how colours were actually, there was a kind of national identity of colour in painting. Like in France, there was a lot to do with light, sort of blues and yellows, and then in Germany there's particular green and brown, and in England it would be grey with a lot of white tone. And sometimes I'll make I haven't got it here, I've got one in my studio where I thought, oh, I'll put all this white tone in to make an English painting, even though the subject's not English. I think there's also something to do with scale of ambition, perhaps complexity of an image, which is why I've always responded more to American painting than British. Yeah, I don't know if there's a kind of jokiness in a lot of British painting, and I use humour but I don't do jokes.
So I think that might be quite, in talking about the flavour of the exhibition, maybe we should ask Marcus a little bit about that. You know, like I said earlier, I can't imagine Gwen John being in this show. You know, it's.
We had a discussion about Gwen John.
But for the main, the work is quite up there. It's quite confrontational. Do you think that's something you
I
did
don't
deliberately?
recognise that. I don't recognise that.
No?
No.
What do you think unites your choices? How would you characterise them?
Stuff I like. Stuff I like. Attached to people that I like and their sort of story a bit and how I've come to know them. The kind of things chose themselves in life. The exhibition grew kind of on the back of a sort of strange idea that was something else, and then got some traction. Then relationships were formed, and then work was offered, and without attempting to illustrate an idea or argue an idea, things just sort of gelled. Yeah, because Cherry and I were talking about this for years. I had this idea actually, and what I am actually interested in is there such a thing as gendered painting or gendered anything these days? And I had this idea that we would have this exhibition like a competition, so it would be the men at one end and the women at the others, and the men would have to be as manly as possible, and the women would have to, then we'd plan it, and then there might be a bit of response or sort of cooking it before, and then we'd go at it and do your worst. And it wasn't because one is good and one is bad, it's because in painting, as makers, the one thing that's always thrown out there very quickly is that the painting and the gestural is a very macho thing. So it gets to be a gendered kind of criticism, critique immediately. You don't even have to do anything. Just do that, so that. And then it's we're looking at a gendered thing. So what will be, I was going to be the man, I was going to be the geezer, and horny bits and tits and bunnies and thrown around. And then we find some, women who come back at me, and I don't know why I'm doing that, but it might be a bit like that, because I was doing that. And this is in my imagination, because Phil said, well, no one else is going to be your team, and you're not going to get the girls on that side of things. But that leads into the idea about how dull group shows are, because we need it as sort of painting communities and making communities. We need these exhibitions just to keep us going, to keep our packers up, give it fun. But they sort of become parties, and they lose a lot of traction in the work, I have to say. They become very distracted and contradictory. And the themes are very dubious, the curation is over-egged, and often for the benefit of the curator, and sort of leaves us makers stranded. So I kind of wanted to do something where there's a bit more flavour and energy in an idea for a show. So forget my sort of silly idea to begin with, but then the basilisk quote is hovering around somewhere, and you kind of want to know, it's not gone away. Is there something that he's just saying wrong that we're not quite, that we're sort of all anxious to know about? I mean, just in terms of our sort of gender positions, does it have an aesthetic expression? So that these are flavours. These are not ideas that I can actually went to. It sort of propelled an idea. The quote I think is ridiculous, and when someone uses a market as justification.
Oh yeah, you should explain that actually, because we didn't do the whole quote.
Should we do it? Is it? I mean, for me, it's an interesting one. Do you want to read it out?
Okay, this is Basilisk saying, he says the market doesn't lie. As pointed out, ridiculous, because the market has always lied. Anyway, the market doesn't lie, even though the painting classes in art academies are more than 90% made up by women. It's a fact that very few of them succeed. It's nothing to do with education or chances or male gallery owners. It's to do with something else, and it's not my job to answer why it's so. It doesn't just apply to painting either, but also music. Why does it matter so much? If women are ambitious enough to succeed, they can do so, thank you very much. But up until now, they have failed to prove that they want to. Normally, women sell themselves well, but not as painters.
Or, if we're going down an evolutionary biological route, is there something in that? That's the dark kind of horizon there that gets my juices flowing a little bit. That's a sort of side argument, because I didn't get into the excitement of this show to illustrate that. But who wants to be in the market anyway? It's destroying everything. This sort of, since the end of the Cold War, sort of collapsed art history as far as I'm concerned, and it's just become one market that's going towards a precipice. But looking at what the function of painting actually is, there are some people that would argue it's an extension of the masculine courtship ritual for the females, that are not just sort of little brown objects looking at all this. They're machines with minds whirring like the internet, calculating everything that the men are doing. The men are doing as they kind of kill themselves and strut and show their colour and do all this sort of painterly kind of stuff. So at one end, it depends how far you're going to take the argument, but there's something intriguing for me personally about that. It's getting off the subject.
Yeah, I wondered if we could go back to what you were talking about gesture. Because, I've got a quote here from Margaret Iverson, where she says, she's talking about the challenge to the dominance of the gesture, post-abstract expressionism. And she says that we need to clear the air of metaphysical cant which surrounded abstract expressionism, especially the importance attached to the unique individuality of the expressionist gesture, which then comes to stand for masculine authorship. And
who says that though?
It's
she's saying that.
So I just wanted to say on this, because as I understand it, Basilisk made that quote because Cecily Brown's auction prices had gone above his. He was just basically jealous.
He does say that she's one of the
so
exceptions.
the stuff about them, I think he's probably somebody who does believe in the market because he's very high up within it. But when a woman artist superseded him, I think he had a little tantrum.
Okay.
Which isn't surprising, I guess, because artists like him, he's a great painter despite being a sort of sexist pig, probably have very big egos. And he was just having a tantrum. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I don't know what he means by the first thing he says, like women are good at, what was the quote?
Oh, he says they're good at
Selling themselves.
selling things.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
are they?
I mean, as
Well,
you
they do sell things.
Sell themselves well.
You know,
No, I just
if they're
wondered
wearing a
what that
bikini
meant.
and lying on the car,
There
quite
is
often they
something
sell the
about gesture,
car.
though. Start
Maybe that's
scale. I
what we
mean,
meant.
you went like this,
Mm.
you know, and that is true too. I think scaled up, you know, like I can only speak. I mean, it's just my stuff, but you're constantly being told to make big work because it's going to be good on a big wall, you know. And there's something about the domestic scale of it and stuff that was a real issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose the thing that I wanted to bring up was this thing about gesture.
Yeah,
And
being-
you know, the gestural, author's mark, the mark of authority, and that sort of sense of it being equated with masculine authority at a particular historical moment. Obviously, it's not wedded to that forever, but at that moment, it was, you know, it was understood in that way. When you look at Rosalie's work, but those little marks that she was making there definitely came out of a relation to gesture and thinking about different ways in which you could mark the canvas in sort of almost, and it's interesting you've hung it next to the knitted work, because she definitely had that in mind when she was making that work, that you would sort of, rather than, you know, a sort of assert on the canvas, you would build the canvas up from a series of small marks that would start in the top left-hand corner and finish in the bottom right-hand corner, and you wouldn't have your epiphany halfway through, you would just make it. So those kind of small, you know, she was working with the 00 brush, making these kind of very small paintings explicitly as anti-gestural paintings, or, you know, there was a reduction of
Ditto.
gesture.
But so does Lucian Freud paints like that as well.
No.
He paints in time gestures.
Yeah, I'm not saying that this is intrinsically what women do. I'm just saying that I know that because I was working with her that period, that those works came out of that discussion.
People often in the past thought my drawings would say, "Oh, I thought your drawings. I thought you'd be a man," because my drawings, you know, there's a large gesture to them. I mean, I can also draw a very small gesture, but there's that kind of lyricism and I mean, there's a kind gestural mark that they didn't associate with a woman.
Yeah.
And Cecily Brown's a good case in point because she had to go to America to make a career, you know, as a painter. And
Exactly.
Germany, one of the reasons I left Germany was because you don't get to be a female figurative painter in Germany, apart from Rosa Lloyd, you know, and she's Neo Rauch's work. All the female painters, like Jutta Kotter, people like that, they all had to go to New York, Silke Otto Nass, LA and London. They all had to move to make their mark, and even now you look at German painting, actually to do with the figure, there are certainly people like Katharina Gross who are allowed a career, but they don't allow women.
But is that more to do with the market than whether or not?
I think I think it's also still a very patriarchal society, which is, you know, kind of funny as well. It's not. I find it slightly amusing that it's so weird.
But it's like this idea that the gesture belongs to men. Like I read what I read online of the interview. He was saying he wasn't really explaining why women can't paint. You know, he didn't have any kind of reasoning behind it, and contradicted himself in this interview I read. But he says that women aren't brutal enough. That men have brutality and women aren't brutal. You know. So it's something to do with that gesture, you know, belongs to men.
Yeah, I mean, I think I find that kind of essentialist discussion really dull because, but I do think that historically you can say that there was ownership of a particular way of marking the canvas at a particular moment, and that it came to stand for things historically. But I think, you know, in terms of what our choice is now, it seems pretty irrelevant, I would have thought, because we're not, we don't operate in that way as artists. Are there any?
Well, I don't know. Sorry, which bit do you find dull?
A kind of essentialist argument that one gender would mark a canvas differently to another gender.
Yeah, but that's what he's.
But that,
No,
that's,
yeah,
but
he's
that is
stuck
where
in.
we're at. You know,
That's what he's stuck in.
Yeah.
Exactly. I
That's
think
his
it's a leftover of a conversation that doesn't seem that relevant now.
So it's not true at all.
Well, they try to do. I
It's
mean,
not
if
just
you
maybe
look
it's the
at
brutality. Maybe
if you look at Lucy Lippard's From the Centre, they have this conversation where they're looking at. They say you can tell the gender of an artist just by looking at a work, and then they go, oh yeah, it's got circles in it, it's got organic forms, it's blah blah blah, and then you know that every time you do that, you can contradict it because there will be an artist that comes along and you'll get the gender wrong, and you will. It won't be a universal application. They were trying to do that in the 70s, but I'm not sure why you would want to do that actually. Even if
Talking
you
about gender in the binary is a bit boring in itself as well, isn't it? I mean, it would be interesting to see some work by non-binary artists in that respect.
Exactly, that's what I mean. I feel like there's a kind of fluidity, a kind of ambiguity, kind of slipping between different modes of marking that operates now just as a given. So I'm less interested in that conversation, but I do think it's very important for feminist art historians to point that out, you know, in the 70s and 80s, because it hadn't been said before.
Question. Just in terms of a very certainly vigorous, I don't know, political textualism, is it Judith Bernstein? I think she's been doing it a long time. So, maybe the market doesn't like it from a woman, even though it's plenty available. The question I had was I was thinking back to when I was a child and I saw Francis Bacon on television. I remember feeling excited about the fact that he was gay and an atheist and lots of other things that I could relate to apart from a big painter. Do you remember times when you saw artists, as you were growing up, that excited you about the possibility of being one and whether their gender was important?
Francis Bacon, yeah, totally, really exciting and Renaissance painting.
I think that's a really good question, and I think, in a sense, that there's a great quote from Lee Krasner when she said, "The history of painting is essentially male, but it's my history." And there has to be a sense of for a female painter to claim that history as well, not feel outside of that history. So, in a sense, you may need some sort of shining examples of women who have succeeded, and probably we've all got some artists that are quite important to us, but we're not excluded from the history of painting if we're painting. I don't know. I mean, how do you feel about it?
I don't feel that, but maybe I'm just not aware. I don't know. I've never felt that. I suppose
You never felt excluded, or you never felt that
I
you
did- I've
needed
never-
an example.
No, I've never felt excluded, but I think because I was brought up in a very matriarchal home, and so I never had respect for men in that way. The men were sort of subordinate in my upbringing, so I never felt that I was restricted.
And what
That's
about
I
when you
mean.
came to make art?
No, I suppose I didn't. I mean, I didn't paint at art school. I made performance videos, and there were so many women, kind of, you know, performance artists, women that I liked, that I didn't feel that it would be, I would have difficulties in doing that as a female, you know, that there was a place for that. I suppose in painting, yeah, but so many people I know are female painters, and I don't ever feel that it's not possible, or I suppose there's something about the market that feels restrictive, that this idea that you have to go big as well to, you know, show, and there is that's, and I don't know if that's patriarchy. I don't really know. I haven't really.
And what about women when they talk about other women's work?
What do you mean?
You know, like
yeah, I mean, for me, there's something about
doing that.
finding. Helen Chadwick, I suppose, was one of the first people that I looked at and thought, you know, there's something about other women doing stuff that kind of gives you permission to do stuff.
Yeah.
And so there is something about just, you might not do it consciously, but you're having a conversation. I think as an artist, you have conversations in your head with other artists, right? And I think some of them, as a woman, you want them to be, those conversations to be with another woman. I don't know, when I started off, I went off to find, historically, a lot of, to go and see Artemisia Gentileschi's work, to go and see a lot of the Renaissance female painters, because I just felt like I needed to have that history. But then again, you know, I feel a bit of a dinosaur. I was at art school at a time when I wasn't taught by a woman. You know, it was a different moment.
Yeah.
So maybe I had to do that because of that.
I mean, I never cared. I don't care. I care about the work. You know, that's what I respond to. And I didn't come to being a painter through a natural route. So the first artist that I know I really fully connected with was Raymond Pettibon from when I was 13, finding Sonic Youth album. And then, you know, that, you just find these kind of, think about this recently, you find these kind of nodes that you know, return back to Pettibon because of this openness of narrative, which is actually one of the things I'm working with a lot. And then when I decided, I didn't go to the National Gallery until I was 28, I think 29. And I think it was just because I just thought it was like full of this old dead history, not particularly male. It was just this weight. I'd always been suspicious of painters who sat around smoking roll-ups, and you know, they didn't really seem to do anything. So I went in and started to draw from a painting which seemed very anachronistic, and so I thought, right, okay, this is ridiculous, I'm going to choose the most absurd painting I can. So I took Rubens' The Rape of the Sabines, and drew that, and I fell in love with it. And it taught me about my drawing, and it taught me then about what I could possibly do with painting. And so I didn't care who it was by. It was about, well, I have the freedom, you know, everyone has the freedom to enter into anybody's work in any way they choose.
Can I pick up on something everybody says, which interests me, and it's about, you know, when you ask some people, they describe themselves. Some people say they're an artist, some people say they're a painter. It's probably, you know, we'll have that discussion about how you represent yourself. But what struck me in finding out about all of you guys, that you all do other things or have been by a circuitous route. So you did maths, didn't you?
Yeah. But I mean, one of the reasons I painted was going to the Munch Museum when I was doing that, and the thing about Munch and his contemporaries who were mostly writers was that they were terrified of women, and they believed in the equality of them. In fact, Strindberg, he thought women had a lot more power than men, and it came from reading Greek tragedies and the sort of battle between matriarchy and patriarchy, and how he thought that the old gods, which were the Furies, were actually the really powerful ones, and it was and they believed in blood relationships rather than marriage relationships, and that the blood relationships were the only real ones, so you only really knew who your mother was. And so they thought, well, Strindberg particularly thought that men were nothing in that sort of situation, and there was a fear, in Munch's paintings of the power of women, because they all believed in free love, but they really didn't like that women could do that, and so that kind of all of that interests me, and Greek tragedy interests me for that reason as well.
So, I suppose this thing about, one of the things that in that Basilit's conversation is he says that the women shouldn't be, or aren't naturally, whatever he means by that, single-minded. And so when I was reading about you guys and realising that, you worked in the film industry and you've worked at a high level within music, and that you did maths to begin with, and I was finding out about you worked in illustration, didn't you, before? No? I got that wrong?
Yeah.
Sorry. But there was a sense in which that the artist, I felt, that there was a kind of divergence from a sort of quite narrow track.
I mean, writing is more when I haven't made images of it.
And I wondered whether, there's obviously it's a kind of trope of women multitasking and doing lots of different things, but whether there was something in that sort of lateral thinking rather than a kind of a sort of narrow track, as it were.
I've always worked in really macho industries. Like, I think I was one of 3 women in a startup company in the film business, and then music was, like super masculine, hyper masculine, older sort of dinosaurs, kind of thing. And I know that on the occasions when I thought I just want to get chucked out of this band and played like it that night, that was brilliant. You know what I mean? It was like we really couldn't have cared less, and just loud, obnoxious, taking over. They were like brilliant, really interesting. When I had elbows, kind of thing. And I think that's. I know this is I'm straying into something that's been plowed over a million times. Far better. I don't know. I'm not really well read about, but this thing about gesture again and having your space. That is still very. I think that is still really, a big barrier. That thing of like taking the floor a bit.
Yeah, I think it's something.
And you find other strategies and.
Yeah. You wanted to say something more?
I forgot what it was. Something to do with having kids and what you were saying about
Having kids, that's
focus. I mean, men have to do these different things now. There's not many people just go boom, start selling work with a gallery and have that career. Very few.
Yeah.
There are some women that do it. Most people have to have jobs. We're the only people that have to have a job to pay for being an artist.
Yeah,
They give the work away to the gallery.
True, yeah.
So you've got to have 3 jobs anyway.
Yeah, no, well, exactly. I mean, that's the interesting thing with children, isn't it? It's not. It's the third job.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it's
the money job, the art job. It's children.
Yeah, but it's nothing to be sneezed at, is it? It's our lives. That's how we get on. And there's a conversation that we need to have about what it takes to actually throw yourself into that, sort of, to make a world in a canvas or as an art object. You kind of need to sort of pull yourself out of this one way or another, and sort of throw yourself into that with huge commitment. And there just isn't. That's a superhuman task in itself. Historically, it's been people that come from the wealthy classes that have been able to afford to do that. And so it's a hard thing to do, but it's harder still if you want that. And so my experience of my colleagues is that they don't have children, they make a sacrifice. And a costly one as well. It's not that they don't want them, it's just that they can't do it. They've got to have a job, they've got to have a studio, and if they're in love with this, or they can't help but be committed to this life, that's a sacrifice they make. And if you don't, it does take you out of it. There's a lot more dads in the playground now, a lot more stay-at-home dads. You know, culture is changing, obviously, but that's why there is this big hole.
Yeah, we had a conversation about that, and so I've got this Phila de Barlow quote. Obviously, Phila de Barlow is such a shining example. She's had 5 kids and got a career, obviously later in life. But she says, I think what gets written out of the whole debate about how you try and combine being a mother with something outside motherhood is that it gets very conflicted, not because of the time, but emotionally. You become torn between 2 utterly conflicting activities, both intensely creative, but they demand totally different aspects of creativity. I don't know whether there's heads nodding there.
Yeah, she also said that it depends a lot on having a supportive partner, and I think that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from children or any of that, I think what you also need is, I needed solitude. And it was only when I went and had a studio of my own that I lived in for a while in Leipzig that I taught myself to paint, And I knew that you need solitude, and you need space and time. And being in some people, it's not solitude, but usually it's being able to lock a door. And perhaps historically men have been able to do that more. And it's only now that everyone's able to claim it, although there's less space to do it in, perhaps, which makes it more difficult for everyone.
Any more questions?
I was just mulling over the whole gestural talk that we had, and how men can be more brutal, which might be why it works. It's more acceptable for them to be doing gestural painting. But then I kind of thought of Jo Mitchell, whose some of her paintings are incredibly dark and brutal and very, very gestural. So I think that sort of work can be, claimed by women as well.
Yeah, and Linda Need writes really well about the gesture in Mitchell's work, and has quite an interesting relationship to her as a person as well.
Yes.
So it's I think she's a really good choice, and that's what I'm saying. Whatever if you start characterising things, you're always going to find an exception, which sweeps that particular sort of stereotype away. So, good point.
Something like Agnes Martin. The opposite.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, what time are we on?
Yeah, we've gone over an hour.
Yeah,
so
okay.
We're there.
All right. If you can't say it out loud, come up and talk to us afterwards. Right, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.